Good evening. My name is Jonathan Kaplan. I am an associate professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and the associate director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. On behalf of the center, its director, Dr. Tatiana Lichtenstein, and its affiliate faculty, I would like to welcome you to this evening's faculty discussion, Anti-Semitism and the Far Right in America. The insurrection at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, highlights the ongoing prevalence of anti-Semitic rhetoric and beliefs in various far-right movements in the United States. Similar expressions of anti-Semitism were on display during the August 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Far-right extremists have also committed violent hate crimes against Jewish communities throughout the United States, including the murder of 11 congregants at the Tree of Life or the Simcha synagogue in Pittsburgh on October 27, 2018, and the violent attack on a synagogue in Poway, California, 7 months later that left 1 dead and 3 injured. In response to these disturbing events, the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin brings together tonight a faculty panel to discuss the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and the far right in America. Tonight's panel was organized by the Schusterman Center in order to foster critical academic conversation about this phenomenon and to contribute to a wider campus conversation about the prevalence of anti-Semitism in American life. Tonight's event is not intended to be a one-off event. Anti-Semitism persists in all sectors of society in the United States, regardless of where one falls on the political spectrum. Our intention is to organize other events that will address other aspects of anti-Semitism. By shining a focused light on anti-Semitism and far-right movements in America, our hope is that we will be able to gain a better understanding of this specific expression of anti-Semitism. This evening's panel is being held using the Zoom webinar platform. The chat function has been disabled for general use. After presentations by each of the panelists and some discussion moderated by Professor John Hoberman, we will have some time for Q&A from the audience. I encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat function if you are on a computer. This feature is available on the top of your screen if you are on an iPad. Please ask questions as you have them throughout the evening. I will curate the questions at the end of our time together and pose them to our panelists. Before I introduce our moderator, I would like to extend thanks to Galit Peratzor and Nicole Farrell for their tireless work behind the scenes to make this event a reality. In addition, I would like to thank the over 25 co-sponsors for this event from around campus. I refer you to the Schusterman Center website for a full list of them. I am grateful for their enthusiastic support of this event and their hard work to get the word out about it. I would now like to welcome Professor John Hoberman, who is our moderator for this evening's panel. Professor Hoberman is a professor in the Department of Germanic Studies at UT Austin. He is a social and cultural historian who has researched and published extensively in the fields of sports studies, race studies, human enhancements, medical history, and globalization studies. He has taught an important course on anti-Semitism at UT since 1985, and his research on the topic includes his doctoral dissertation on Norwegian fascism, articles on Norwegian and French fascism, and book chapters on anti-Semitic folklore about the Jewish male. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hoberman.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. My name is John Hoberman, and as Professor Kaplan said, I'm a professor of Germanic Studies here at UT, and the History of Anti-Semitism course has been given now for the past 35 years. And I will never forget meeting that anti-Semitism class on November the 10th, 2016, 2 days after the election that had put Donald Trump into the White House. The outcome of that election was the most shocking experience of my lifetime, and I chose to express that fact to my students. I know, I said, that my status as a Jew in the United States has changed, that a new element of risk had entered Jewish life. The dramatic increase in anti-Semitic actions and killings during the Trump years has confirmed that premonition. So where do we find ourselves today? It was not that long ago that I could tell UT students that one characteristic of the lunatic fringe is that it is situated on the fringe of American political life. But that is no longer the case, as even QAnon-style lunacy is flowing into the Republican Party, along with the anti-Semitic resentments right-wing lunatics often bring with them. This Republican Party has evolved into an enormous incubator that is now primed to nurture anti-Semitic fantasies, resentments, and sadistic dreams of revenge against the Jewish global cabal wherever these evil conspirators can be found. So this, in short, is the dangerous predicament in which we currently find ourselves, and I am referring on the larger scale to our American democracy in general, as well as the specific situations of Jewish Americans. It is therefore an appropriate time to offer our audience a panel on anti-Semitism and the far right. Now I would like to present to you our panelists. Hina Azam is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at UT Austin. Her research interests are in women and gender in Islam, Islamic law, and Islam in America. She teaches a wide range of courses in Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies and serves as the graduate advisor for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UT. Outside of teaching and research, she is very interested in the interdependency between democracy, sustenance, human rights, and civil society. She is concerned about the particular effects of authoritarianism on the rule of law and of native populism on religious and ethnic minorities, whether abroad or in the United States. She's on the steering committee for the Jefferson Center in Core Texts and Ideas, through which she organizes Sustaining Democracy, a reading and discussion group for students here at UT Austin. Jeremy Suri holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas. He is a professor in the university's Department of History and the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. Professor Suri is the author and editor of 10 books on contemporary politics and foreign policy. His most recent book, The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, was widely reviewed across the United States. Professor Suri's research and teaching have received numerous prizes. In 2007, Smithsonian Magazine named him one of America's top young innovators in the arts and sciences. In 2018, he received the President's Associate's Teaching Excellence Award from UT and the Pro Bene Emeritus Award for contributions to the liberal arts. His writings appear widely in blogs and print media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Houston Chronicle, the Atlantic, Wired, the New Republic, Foreign Policy, and others. Professor Suri is also a frequent public lecturer and guest on radio and television programs. He hosts a weekly podcast, This is Democracy, which is available through his professional webpage. Professor Chris Viles is professor of English and director of American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Since 2013, his work has focused on anti-fascist and fascist movements in the United States. He is the co-editor with Bill Mullen of the U.S. Anti-Fascism Reader, published by Verso in 2020, and the author of Haunted by Hitler, Liberals, the Left, and the Fight Against Fascism in the United States, published by Massachusetts in 2014. He is at work on a new project, on far-right movements and their impact on US culture from the 1920s to the present. He has also appeared on PBS, NPR, CBC Radio, and in Jacobin Magazine, among other public venues, to discuss fascism, anti-fascism, and United States political culture. And now I would like to invite Professor Biles to speak to us for approximately 5 minutes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, John, for that introduction. And thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me here. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for taking the time this evening to be here for this very serious and timely topic. And what I wanted to address here briefly is something fairly specific, which is the conspiratorial frame of the far right, particularly in my area of expertise, the United States. We don't have to look far for conspiracy mindedness in the contemporary far right. We have in the United States, we have QAnon, which by now most everyone is familiar with. We have pervasive right-wing narratives of shadowy conspiracies directed by George Soros, the Rothschilds and their space lasers. And locally in Austin, you have Alex Jones with his Sandy Hook conspiracy theories directed at my current state of Connecticut. I probably don't need to explain to this audience that conspiracy mindedness and anti-Semitism is intimately connected. But anti-Semitism, unlike, say, anti-Black or anti-Latinx racism, generally depends on a narrative of hidden power, enormous wealth, and secret control. It doesn't originate in the need to dehumanize a laboring class. Rather, it often channels class resentments towards shadowy elites. Fascist and quasi-fascist movements the world over tend to be fueled by a middle to lower middle class base, with some exceptions, of course. Many Klansmen in Indiana in the 1920s, for example, were small business owners facing threats from large corporations and big retailers. Rather than blame big business for the threats to their retail stores, they would blame Jewish retailers who control supplies chains through shadowy networks. Anti-Semitism, in other words, can sometimes ethnicize a class grievance. In other words, I don't blame the rich or capitalism, I blame George Soros and other shadowy international bankers. A phrase that widely circulated among German social democrats in the 1890s comes into play here, which is that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. This explains why we so often find anti-Semitism on the right. But to take a quick step back, we should reflect on what makes the difference between left versus right. A belief in either big government versus small government isn't a reliable indicator of left-wing versus right-wing views over place and time. There's always been a statist right, for instance. Following political theorists Norberto Bobbio and Corey Robbins, what really puts someone on the left or the right is their deeper views of human equality and social hierarchy. To Bobbio, as you move to the left, people are more equal than unequal. As you move to the right, it's the opposite. People are more unequal than equal. For Robbins, what unites the right is a belief in social hierarchy. It's a belief in the naturalness, even desirability, of a world with different social levels and tiers. So anti-Semitism allows someone to channel class resentment above, but still maintain their belief in social hierarchy. You might blame international bankers, but not capitalism in the upper classes as a whole. You blame ill-begotten Jewish wealth, but not wealth. On the American far right, anti-Semitism can also work in tandem with anti-Black racism, and it frequently does. The infamous neo-Nazi novel, The Turner Diaries by William Pierce, is a good example. In the dystopian world of The Turner Diaries, the protagonist is beset by a liberal regime in which Jewish liberals are the brains and the money, and they command armies of hapless Black foot soldiers who serve as the muscle and the brawn. This is the old producerist idea of parasites above and below. But we see a contemporary corollary in the right's phrase cultural Marxism, which even appeared amongst one of Trump's staffers. Cultural Marxism is a narrative that blames multiculturalism on the Frankfurt School. In other words, rather than seeing multiculturalism as a liberal response to civil rights, it's basically part of a kind of a Jewish intellectual conspiracy and network in which Jews are the hidden agents of kind of Black advancement. So in sum, to understand why anti-Semitism finds itself on the right so often, you have to understand how it fits into the overall structure of what Adorno and others called the authoritarian personality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And now I'd like to invite Professor Suri to speak with us for about 5 minutes.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. It was not allowing me to unmute, excuse me. First, I just want to thank the organizers, Jonathan, Galit, Nicole, my colleague Tatiana, for organizing this timely and important panel. I hope this is just the beginning of many conversations we'll have on campus and in the broader community about these issues. I have a slightly different point of view from my colleague, John Hoberman, who I have such high regard for. Anti-Semitism in American history has been a fringe force, but it's been a fringe force that's long been a mainstream force as well. And it is true that the far right fringe has become the mainstream of the Republican Party, and that might be surprising. But anti-Semitism has long been mainstream in American history. It has gone through different cycles in its expressions. But it's hard to think of a moment in our history, especially a moment of challenge and opportunity, a moment of transition, which is every moment, of course, where anti-Semitism has not been a significant part of our history. It varies in its expressions. It varies in its particular language, but it has been there throughout our history from the founding through to the present, of course. 3 points I wanted to put on the table, really as I think points that most historians would agree with, and points that I think are foundational for our discussion of where we are today, historical points that give us a framework for thinking about where we are today. First, I think anti-Semitism in its repeated prevalence and pervasiveness in American society is deeply connected to what Richard Hofstadter and others called status anxiety. And for a long time, historians, especially when I was a graduate student a little while ago, it's a long time ago now, we sort of discounted status anxiety. We thought we were beyond that as a point of historical analysis. I think the last 10 years have reminded us how important status anxiety is. Those who feel that they are losing their place, that they are confronting downward mobility, repeatedly in American history, turn to anti-Semitism as a way of differentiating themselves from those they see competing with them, whether they're international or domestic forces, and ways of boosting their position. Even though the local hardware store can't compete anymore, I'm still not Jewish. And the ones who are threatening me are those Jews somehow, some way. It is the moments, Hofstadter told us, of declining status for those who are not at the top, but in the middle to the high ranges of American society, whether it's economic, social, or cultural, that they turn to anti-Semitism as a way to try to boost themselves and explain away and confront and resist what they see as sources of downward mobility for them. And Hofstadter, writing in the shadow of McCarthyism, which had very strong anti-Semitic overtones, especially in the confrontation between McCarthy, Roy Cohn, Richard Nixon, and the targets in Hollywood, the targets in the educational sphere. Hofstadter pointed to the role of religion, how religion became a way of justifying anti-Semitism, how the return to religious parable, the return to biblical prophecy became a way of providing what he called a legitimate eschatological veneer upon what was a status anxiety expressed as a historical enmity, and that these two things would come together. He wrote about that in the 1950s. I think we see a recurring pattern of that, and we're seeing a boosting up, we're seeing a sprouting of that in our world today. Second, and particularly important, I think, is that anti-Semitism has always been accompanied by philo-Semitism, often from the same people. I wrote a whole book about Henry Kissinger, and throughout his career, the people who hate Jews are often the people who love him as they still hate Jews. And he's often seen by many Jew haters as the exceptional Jew. And that's part of the story. Many anti-Semitic advocates in the United States, and this is certainly not unique to the United States, many who buy into anti-Semitic attitudes also buy into the notion that Jews are somehow uniquely talented, somehow uniquely capable, somehow uniquely connected. And if you're Nelson Rockefeller or you're Richard Nixon, you hate that the Jews have those connections, but you want to have one for yourself in your court. You want your court Jew. You want your family Jew. And so there is a way in which the anti-Semites can on a surface look like they're embracing Judaism because they embrace certain Jewish figures in their circle. Usually not treated anywhere near equally, usually reminded of their Jewishness all the time, as every major Jewish policymaker that I've studied is by American policymakers who are not Jewish. But nonetheless, that Jewish figure is an empowered figure for the purpose of pursuing a program that has strong anti-Semitic overtones to it. I think that's an important way of understanding the what looks strange, but is actually historically predictable connection between what John appropriately called the far right, the extreme right, and Israel today. The extreme right is rabid in its militaristic support of Israel, but that is not support of Jews. It's actually filled with anti-Semitic judgments about Jews or about the majority of Jews. It's an argument for certain exceptional Jews as the Jews who have the kind of power all the Jews have, but the few Jews who are the appropriate Jews for us to work with, often at the cost of all the other Jews. So this strange relationship, but historically contingent relationship that we see repeatedly within our history at certain moments of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. What's contingent about it today is its connection now to Zionism as well, and to the state of Israel, and to Benjamin Netanyahu's politics, Likud politics in Israel in particular. And then the third element, in addition to the sort of recurring patterns of anti-Semitism with status anxiety, the connections between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, is the prevalence of violence. And this has to be said as clearly as possible. Violence is at the center of American history. We have a particularly violent history. We don't talk about it or write about it that way, but we have a particularly violent history. We are one of the most violent societies. The violence is often expressed as one group attacking another group, whether it's slavery, lynching, whether it's attacks on civil rights activists of one kind or another, whether it's low-level violence. We have a history of terrorism that goes back at least 100 years. And that violence is almost always connected to anti-Semitism for the very simple reason that those who are using violence as a form of expression, those who see violence as a way of valorizing their position, are always looking for vulnerable groups to be their targets. And so there's a political reason why Jews, like African Americans and others, are often picked out, but there's also a convenience to it. In a violent society, the violent actors need targets. You can't be a successful violent actor if you don't have people to express your violence upon. To put it very clearly, right, the use of violence for political purposes requires bodies that are to be scarred by that violence for the violent actors to be able to show their superiority and their power in our society. And we talk about this, many of us as historians, about the militarization of American politics in the post-45 period, but it's a militarization that's long been there. And it is a continuity, I think, from the experience of lynching, which targeted Jews as well as African Americans and Catholics and other groups, to what we're seeing today. I would argue that in the last year, what we saw were the lynchings of many African Americans by the police, and we saw attempted lynchings of Jews, or the rhetoric of lynching, whether it's on January 6th, whether it's the way people talk about George Soros, whether it's even some of what we've seen here in Austin, Texas. And I think this is important for us to recognize. This sounds like a depressing story. I want to close on an optimistic note. We know so much more about this today than we have in the past. There are more of us studying this. There's so much really good scholarship produced by many of the people who are listening and should be on this panel too, and I hope we'll be on future panels to talk about these issues. Knowledge is the best antidote to anti-Semitism, not because knowledge eliminates anti-Semitism, but it allows us to prepare and take appropriate action and make sure our institutions are doing the right things, if possible. My grandfather, my Jewish grandfather, always said that the worst thing was to have anti-Semites around you and not know they're there. It's far better to know when they're there. We now know they're there. We know they've been there a long time, and we know they're not going away. We can take appropriate action, and maybe that's something we'll talk about more today. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And now I'd like to invite Professor Azam to address us for approximately 5 minutes or so.
Hello, I want to start off by giving my thanks to Jonathan Kaplan and the Schusterman Center for, and all the co-sponsors, the many co-sponsors for this really important event, and to John Hoberman for his introduction to me. I'm also just very happy to be invited to participate, unlike the other two panelists who have written on this topic and have, or also John, who teaches on this topic. My experience is sort of informal, and so I'm happy to participate as a Muslim, because I think it's really important to have Muslim voices on this topic. And my contribution today is sort of in the range of sort of personal experiences as a Muslim child of immigrants, as a non-white American, because race is obviously a part of this whole conversation, and as a scholar of Islamic studies. So I want to share just some of my thoughts / observations on the whole phenomenon of anti-Semitism, because I've kind of come to it in a sort of kind of a roundabout way. Just as sort of background, I spent my very young years in Skokie, Illinois, so I was there when the Nazis marched in the early 70s. And it was just sort of anti-Semitism and that problem was in the air. But then for a long time, it sort of faded out of my view. And most of my adult life, particularly going into Islamic studies, and also being an active member of the Muslim community here in the United States, I've been really focused on two phenomena that have to do with Islam and with being Muslim. The first is the problem of religious extremism among Muslims. September 11th was probably the first major event that kind of really changed not only my thinking, but that of other American Muslims as well. And it sort of provoked a realization that religiously motivated political violence among Muslims was very real and very powerful and potent. It hit very close to home, and it really changed the way that a lot of American Muslims felt about our religious identity. And then there were other major events that really kept my attention really focused on the problem of extremism among Muslims. There was the London and Madrid bombings, and then later there was the rise of ISIS. There were the attacks in Lahore and Pakistan, the Easter attacks that happened in Lahore, Pakistan, and only a few years ago. So, my attention prior to the Trump era was really focused on religious extremism among Muslims. And then the second issue has been the problem of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States against Muslims. And that is something that really came to the fore for me with the rise of Trump. Well, first there was the backlash against Muslims from September 11th. But then with, about 5 years ago, we saw a resurgence in anti-Muslim rhetoric and also actions. And so some of you may know that there were attacks and the burning of mosques. Even here in Texas, there were all sorts of bullying actions that were taken against imams in this state. And so there's been beheadings of Muslims and so forth. So my attention was really focused there on anti-Muslim sentiment. And then, to my utter surprise, I learned that as severe as the anti-Muslim sentiment was, with the resurgence of the right in the last 5 years, the swell in anti-Semitism was just as severe or even worse. We saw attacks on synagogues, flyers posted around UT's campus, swastikas painted in public spaces, neo-Nazi marches, and all of that really stunned me because I thought that the US was past this level of anti-Jewish bigotry. I learned in particular that when I was looking up statistics on hate speech against Muslims in the years 2016 and 17, that anti-Muslim rhetoric had doubled, but anti-Jewish rhetoric had quadrupled. so that, you know, that provoked me then to think more deeply about the relationship between anti-Muslim sentiment in the US and anti-Jewish sentiment in the US, and to start to look for the commonalities and the reasons for why both Jews and Muslims are targets of hatred among a certain segment of the US public that we think of as the far right. And so where that, you know, led me to focus is, or what became evident to me, is that there's a strongly religious element to the far right in the US, and that's something that the previous panelists have talked about. Specifically, far right discourses incorporate and are overlaid not only with whiteness, with race and whiteness, but also Christianity. So for example, we have Christian identity movements that have been growing really since the, you know, through the Obama years, and they've only kind of, they're rising to our attention now, but they've been really simmering for a long time. So I want to be careful in saying that I'm not saying that these are correct or authentic interpretations of Christianity. That's not for me to determine, but there is definitely sort of a religious component to all this. So interestingly, what began as my focus on religious extremism among Muslims has helped me see and understand religious extremism among Christians. And what began as an interest or focus on the targeting of Muslims in Islamophobia has helped me see and understand the targeting of Jews in anti-Semitism. So I'll stop there. Those are just sort of my my reflections on this topic.
Thank you very much, Hina. The schedule calls for a discussion between the moderator and our panelists for about 20 minutes. And what I would like to do is, as I've been taking notes here, compiling a question for each of the panelists that I would like to explore. And I think we have time for more than one of our panelists to weigh in on what the particular question has to be. And in order of presentation, I'd like to start with Chris. You know, you properly reminded us of the enormous importance of the conspiratorial mindset, the sheer gratifications of conspiratorial thinking. I think the pleasure that people derive from being in the in crowd that knows these secrets that the unwashed public is not privy to. The godfather, or the recent godfather of conspiratorial thinking is Donald Trump. Over the past 5 years, he has been this enormously powerful stimulant that has, you know, like a watering can, nourished eccentrics, especially on the right, of every description. And what occurred to me is that we tend to think of the far right, as I mentioned, as out there. You know, it's out there, that the fringe is on the fringe. But I want to explore the idea Donald Trump is the godfather of the latest, you know, version, enormously powerful political version of conspiratorial thinking. And the question I wanted to float to you was, given that Trump is now basically the acting, you know, proprietor of the Republican Party and wields enormous influence, to what extent do you think Trump himself may succumb to the pleasures of conspiratorial thinking to the point where he perceives a political advantage in going after the Jews?
Oh, that's a really excellent and dystopian question. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you're asking, is he going to begin to embrace kind of an open, you know, anti-Semitism? You know, and I think it's possible, right? And he's also kind of shown the flexibility, should we say, of the American political discourse to kind of tolerate things that it didn't tolerate before, right? So it is certainly possible, and I don't know. But, you know, be that it may, I do know that there's certainly an element on the super far right who is displeased even with you know, the presence of, you know, Jared Kushner, right, in his inner circle and things like this, right? So and that's when you get to the kind of the neo-Nazi element. But I think, I mean, what Donald Trump, I think, kind of illustrates also is like what you were talking about and Jeremy was talking about too, is the kind of the mainstreaming of a kind of an anti-Semitic structure, right? That's always been there, right? And so if we think about, you know, over and over, right, in the United States, we have, at least on the kind of the far, I'm not even talking about the anti-Semitic structures that kind of Jeremy is talking about, but it's that anti-Semitic far-right movements, not only the mainstreaming of McCarthyism, but the Coglinite movement in the 1930s, the second Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, elements of the Christian right kind of more recently, right? So it's even the kind of the far-right anti-Semitism has never really been fringe, right? And it does congeal into people like Trump, who are always one step away from doing that. I mean, I think in certain ways, whether Trump or not actually becomes an open anti-Semite, I think the more the more rudimentary question there is that Trump seems to enable an anti-Semitic frame, you know, for his followers, right? In the sense that along the lines that I was talking about, he's the rich man, you know, who can channel class resentment towards other shadowy elites, right? He's the rich man who enables you to still have your faith in social hierarchy, to still have your faith in an upper class, but one that has a well-begotten wealth, which is amazing with Trump, but one that has a supposedly well-begotten wealth rather than the kind of the shadowy wealth of a George Soros or an international globalist elite to which you can pin your kind of conspiracies of real power and control, right? So again, I think Trump as an enabler of an anti-Semitic frame is even more kind of dangerous than and more likely than even him embracing open anti-Semitism, if that makes sense.
That's a very interesting suggestion. I mean, it's certainly the case that he has created the frame for anti-Semites and a whole host of perverse right-wing eccentrics. It may be there's a political calculus in his head that has weighed positive. The other thing is that to me, Trump is really a creature of impulse in a big way. And I think that he is a personality who may, at a certain point, if he's angry enough and frustrated enough, might throw the political calculus away and go after the people he is, you know, he's just angry about. But at any rate, as you say, we don't know. It's a very, very, very volatile situation, and you know, one of the ways I try to cope with all this, talking to students, you know, without sounding hyper partisan, I'll just say to students, I've been around for a long time. This is unprecedented. You know, you say of certain political actors or situations, you say, this is unprecedented. It's an accurate statement, but you know, you're not pushing a political line in that particular.
John, if I could come in on that, because I think you're right, but I also think, as you know as well as anyone, there's more to it than that, right? So Trump is unprecedented because we've never had a president who has been so explicit and so intent on triggering these groups in the way he has. But there are Donald Trump figures throughout our history. They just were not elected president. And those who shared his attitudes as president, as many did before him, didn't express it in the same violent ways he did. So I think this is really important. I think it's important because I'm sure this is what you were intending to say as well. If Donald Trump went away tomorrow, this doesn't go away. It might be the phenomenon might express itself in different ways, but if he were to, you know, disappear, however, that we would still have the same issues and we would still have reason for this panel right now.
No, I'm glad that that you commented, Jeremy, because my next question was for you. But going back to this, I see the significance of Trump maybe differently from you in the sense that, you're absolutely right. If Trump had succumbed to the virus he went courting, then there would be millions and millions of angry people inspired by Donald Trump, and there'd be all sorts of unwholesome things percolating in American politics on a certain wing. But going back to my original question to you was, you mentioned, you remind us, you used the term that that anti-Semitism is a recurring pattern in American history. And you know more about that than I do. But I must say, and I plead guilty of looking at history through a presentist lens, I find it very difficult to avoid thinking about the 243-pound elephant in the room who holds all of this power in American politics right now. It's unprecedented. Here is my question. You point out, for example, that the McCarthy years were very scary for a lot of people. There were people who jumped out of windows as a consequence of McCarthy's vicious demagoguery. And you also know he had two Jewish sidekicks, Cohen and Stein, which
of course. Yeah.
Bizarre. I don't know whether that even fits into philo-Semitism. But here's my point. One thing McCarthy didn't have, and one thing Woodrow Wilson and his problems didn't have, so far as Jews are concerned, they didn't have the ecology of the internet. That my question is, do you or do you not agree that there is something about the historical locus of Trumpism, that this personality comes along at a time when the broadcasting anything is super easy. As one journalist once said, the internet is an open sewer. And there is an extent to which that is true. And we know some of the material that comes out of that sewer. So here's my question. Do you think that because of the certain special modern circumstances, including the ease of broadcasting anything, no matter how unwholesome, to unlimited numbers of people, that Trump and Trumpism at this particular point is empowered, is potentiated as a potentially, metastasizing anti-Semitism in a way that, Joe McCarthy of that period was not. And so that your phrase recurring patterns it's absolutely true. The question is this one special in the way that I'm suggesting?
Yeah, it's a great question, John.
In the way that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so recurring patterns, they never recur the same way, right? So every pattern is special, right? Every moment in that pattern is special. So of course, there are many unique elements to this. And I think you're onto something. The internet, particularly not just the 140 characters of Twitter, but the pervasiveness of imagery, the way we are confronted and overwhelmed with images that run across our eyes, that plays to anti-Semitic tropes, because anti-Semitic tropes are all about the deformation of the body, the particular way. There's obviously so much scholarship on this that you and so many others know, right? It's about the perception that Jews are somehow anatomically, genetically different, right? And so that genetic argument, as it's made about races, as it's made about women, can be made in a very prima facie way, and it can hit you in the face and shape your thinking very quickly. And so I think you're right. The internet plays to that. But what I think is the recurring part of this is every new mass communication technology, it seems to me, in our history, if we think of the telegraph, if we think of the radio, if we think of the television, Father Coughlin on the radio, McCarthy on television, right? Mass communication, initially, any new mass communication tool becomes a way of taking the rumor, the innuendo, the whisper, and shouting it louder. That's the easiest thing to do. I tell students, mass communication in its first phase, it's 1.0 in each form, is used for hate before it's used for love and unity, because it's easier to communicate hate. And I think that's where we are. And I think that's why, and maybe this is part of the discussion we need to have, that's why we have to learn from the ways in which we regulated radio. the fairness doctrine, for example, learn from the ways we regulated television, to think about what are the regulations that we need within an internet space. The internet's not going away, but to get to 2.0, to get to a healthier environment, we need to do what we've done with every other mass communication technology, which is put certain regulations in place. And I think we've made progress with Trump off of Twitter.
Yeah.
That's already progress, right? So I think this is just a way of saying you're absolutely right. It's unprecedented, but the precedents we have are helpful in our thinking about how to look at this unprecedented moment.
Or as Tom Standage said, the telegraph was the Victorian internet.
Yeah,
He wrote a great book on it. And the telegraph blew people's minds in the 19th century the same way the internet blows our minds. You know, so that you have an important point there. Right. Thank you very much.
Can I add something a little bit to this really interesting exchange? Is that okay, John?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, listening to this discussion about whether or not, and like this is sort of like a cycle, like Hofstadter talks about, the sort of recurrent, you know, right now in Sustaining Democracy, in fact, we're reading It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. And, you know, it's very interesting because we see the same sorts of anti-Semitic rhetoric, but their Buzz Windrop is a Democrat, right? So it's so interesting. And it so we see the recurrence, but we also see the recurrence in very different shapes and forms each time. But I think that, John, you're onto something when, and that something is power, right? We have recurrences, but with mass technology and with social media and with also Trump arriving to the presidency, which is different. Like Jeremy, you were saying that, you know, there have been people like this before, but they haven't sat in the Oval Office, right?
Right.
So we can't, I think something needs to be said about the power that is, that resided and then resides with Trump as the president and then the former president, and what he brings, what he's able to sort of deploy, what he was able to deploy as president, and having that sort of megaphone, which has nothing to do with sort of a predetermined or a deterministic sort of progress towards ever greater amounts of anti-Semitism, but rather has to do with the particular sort of conjunction of events that led him into the presidency. So I think, John, I think you're trying, there's something you're trying to say, there's something unique about this moment at the same time that maybe it's not unique at all. I don't know, it's sort of interesting.
All right, thank you. Hina, it's time for me to ask you your question. And that is, you are a professional student, among other things, of Islamophobia. You have been in the United States for a long time. You've had a great opportunity to observe how Americans react to Muslim people and the Islamophobia that goes on. Have you any particular ideas about the psychology of the American Islamophobe?
You know, I mean, there's this sort of vibrant debate going on about whether or not Islamophobia is a type of racism. And that debate hinges on whether or not being Muslim, it's not that being Muslim is a race, but whether or not it's perceived as a race, whether it sort of functions as a race, and whether anti-Muslim sentiment sort of covers over underlying feelings about non-white people and people of color among whites. So, I mean, I think that, racism is a central part of Islamophobia because of the fact that so many Muslims happen to be non-white, and those who are light enough skinned to pass as white don't tend to, they don't have to face the direct ramifications of Islamophobia unless they choose to sort of out themselves as Muslim. So I definitely think that, that racism has a role to play in it, or colorism has a role to play in it. But the other part of my answer is that, and I really feel very strongly about this, that that anti-Muslim sentiment is directly tied in with anti-Jewish sentiment and anti-Black sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment and even misogyny. I mean, I think that there's a sort of religious, racial core to this that, you know, where somehow, and also a nationalist core to this. We're not really entirely talking about the fact that, or we are in different ways, but there's a certain way in which being American is defined, has been defined in this country as being both Christian and white. And so if you are not Christian and white, then you don't really belong here. And so Muslims, as being largely immigrant, largely non-white, and also not Christian, sort of are at the receiving end of that. But so are Jews and Latinos and so many other, and Blacks and so many other groups of people. So I think there are things that are unique about Islamophobia, but I think there's a lot that's not unique at all to Muslims. That's just part of an overlapping status anxiety, you know, as you were mentioning, Jeremy.
Well, there will be essentialist fantasies about Muslims, just as there are essentialist, you know, racial essentialism as a fantasy technique for othering whoever it happens to be, you know, whether it's a Black person, or a Muslim person, a Jewish person, a female person. Well, at any rate, it all reminds me of the authoritarian personality, but we don't have time for that.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. Okay, I think the clock is telling us that Jonathan has something on the schedule.
Yes, thank you, John, and thank you all for this excellent conversation heretofore. I want to bring in some of the questions and feedback and comments from our audience today, and there are a lot of questions proceeding on several fronts, and I'm going to try to just merge them into more focused questions for our time together. The first of them really sort of, I think, relates to the fundamental premise of this panel, that there is something distinct about anti-Semitism on the far right. Given, as many questioners are asking, the widespread prevalence of anti-Semitism on the left, also in certain sectors of African American community, or also in other parts of American society, even in some sectors of the Islamic world. Is the political frame really the right frame from which we can approach and appreciate the phenomena of anti-Semitism? Or is there a different way we should be looking at it as we move forward?
Well, I'll say one thing quickly on this. I mean, I think it's certainly true that anti-Semitism crosses political boundaries. That's what makes it so enduring. And Hina was absolutely right. If we were talking about the early 20th century, we were talking about the Democratic Party as being the party that was far more filled with anti-Semites. So it does cross political boundaries. That is all true. But what also matters is where are the most violent acts coming from right now? And it is without doubt that over the last 10 years, the majority of the violent acts against Jews in the United States, Europe's a more complicated story, but in the United States have come from the far right. And the greatest threat to Jewish communities right now is from the far right. That is not to discount or say that there aren't threats and terrible attitudes on the left. They might even be in the same quantity. I don't know. But if I'm concerned about threats to the safety of American citizens, I'm concerned about the far right, and we shouldn't apologize for focusing on it for that reason.
You know, you could also point out that politics, in its way, is the science of power. Politics is about the acquisition, the keeping, the losing, the distribution or non-distribution of power. I don't think we can talk realistically about any racism without including politics as the vehicle for wielding power. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, about the bit of anti-Semitism on the left, I mean, sure. I mean, on the one hand, there are folks who will pretty much be very quick to say that any kind of pro-Palestinian, position is, anti-Semitic. But at the same time, those on the left, if they are going to advance a critique of Israeli policy, do have to be extremely careful that they're not like lapsing into anti-Semitic tropes, of kind of Jewish media control, all of this other kind of things, right? But, in terms of the prevalence of it as a kind of structure, I think, you mentioned an authoritarian personality, and it kind of goes back to this, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying, and what Hina was talking about with the link between kind of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, right? Which is that this really crystallized why anti-Semitism so often close to the structure of the right for me. When you go back to that book, The Authoritarian Personality from 1950, they were talking about one of their case studies, this guy Mack, they called him, right? And there was always a line that he scored high on the F scale, which meant he was, really had a high fascist potentiality. One thing about that they said that really stuck out to me, that really remained with me, they said, the way that Mack talks about the New Deal is the same way that he talks about the Jews, right? Which is that it's something about the structure, as like John was saying, the structure of othering that's in his speech. So it's like this, obsession with strength and weakness, a clear distinction between in-groups, out-groups, the inability to critique in-groups, right? All of these things in the kind of deep structure of how he frames otherness, which also can explain why that same structure can be applied to other groups like Muslims, right? Like, but it's not always transferable, and those racial categories aren't all transposable. Kind of anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism has its very distinct modalities, right? But a lot of it is in the structure of the hierarchical thinking. It's also about the inability to perceive equality between groups and to see group difference as absolute, right? That is, I think, really fundamental to why you so often find an anti-Semitic structure on the right. So.
So it's a thought style,
Mhm.
and it's, as you say, it can be applied to any number of people who are imagined to be aliens.
So just to pick up a thread from one of Chris's comments about the connection of anti-Semitism and the Zionism and the question of policy towards Israel, that can be expressed both in the ways you're highlighting, Chris, on the left, but there's also, I think, another concern that I think was highlighted by Jeremy's comments earlier. And one of our audience members asked the question that there are many Jews, particularly those who have extreme loyalty to Israel, who believe that Trump is, quote, on our side. After all, he moved the Israeli capital, his grandchildren are Jewish, and he's a good friend of Netanyahu. How do we counter all of that to explain he is not a fan of the Jews that many American Jews think he is?
Well, I think there are two ways to counter that are very historically founded. I mean, the first thing is it's not who you pal around with or the particular things you do for maybe other instrumental purposes. It's who are you empowering? Who are you empowering that matters, right? And just look who he's empowered. Look who gets more voice in our society now. Look who is more threatening in our society. Look who was there on January 6th, the people wearing Auschwitz shirts, right? And they were not on the left, they were on the far right, and they were there because he organized them and he told them to go there. Whether that's technically incitement or not, we can have that discussion. But so that's the first thing you got to point out to people, right? There were plenty of anti-Semitic European monarchs in the 18th and 19th century who in the short run did things for the Rothschilds and even maybe at some point sponsored some of Theodore Herzl's work or other things of that sort, but they empowered the people who killed the Jews, right? So that's the most important point. There's a second point, though, to be made about this also, it seems to me, which is when Trump and those who share his views, this could include Stephen Miller, who's Jewish himself, right? When they do these things, are they really trying to help Jews? Or what are they actually trying to do? If they were trying to help Jews in the way Jews think that these people should be on their side, it would seem to me they would do broader things for the community. They wouldn't be doing the things they're doing, which are largely symbolic, largely self-serving, and don't actually serve the Jewish community. So they're helping the bad guys who want to kill us, and they're not doing things that actually help Jews as a whole, only help a few Jews. If that's the way you want to make your politics, if you're one of those few people who's helped by them and that's enough for you, that's fine. But don't say you're doing this because they support Jews. They're doing this because they support you and what you want.
Yeah, I would just reiterate Jeremy's point by asking a very simple question. Can anybody look at the insurrectionist mob of January the 6th and say that that Donald Trump is a friend of the Jews? Seems impossible to me. You know, the Auschwitz shirt is just one manifestation of you know, the disorder and the rage. It's just not a plausible claim.
Jonathan, I want to approach that question sort of from a different angle. And I guess this comes from engaging. So going back to this question, which I wrote down is, how does one respond to pro-Israeli Jews who support Trump because they think he's good for Israel or good for the Jews or good for Israel? And so my response to that comes, I guess, from like decades of having those conversations within the Muslim community. And, you know, conversations about, well, is such and such person good for Muslims? Are they good for Palestine? Are they good for Pakistan? Are they good for, you know, however you want to define one, however Muslims have, you know, defined their in-group. I think this is a place where identity politics can really hurt us, and where we have to decide if we believe in human rights or not, and if we believe in civil rights or not, and if we believe in the dangers of nativism and fascism and authoritarianism or not. And so what I would encourage, I don't know if this is a conversation that can be had, I'm not inside of those communities, but I mean, these have been really difficult conversations within the Muslim community, to say you shouldn't side with somebody just because he happens to be good for you or nice to you or grant you certain favors or privileges at a particular point in time, even if he's harming other people. You know, like, your benefit cannot come at the expense of other people's suffering. So I don't exactly know how that conversation would need to be had, but I think looking at we have to look at things a little bit more substantively and not just consequential, from a consequentialist perspective, like what's sort of good in terms of its consequences and if its effects, but rather what's sort of maybe a little more deontologically. But I just wanted to throw that out there.
So I think one of the other questions which is popping up in the Q&A is the Europe question. I received one question actually before the panel began from an audience member asking about comparisons to Europe, especially in Germany. You know, how does this relate to fascist and anti-Semitic movements within Germany and other parts of Europe? Are there common antecedents? And within that, can we also, you know, consider anti-Semitism to be as one panelist asked, a Eurasian import of sorts? Or is it really polygenetic and thus rooted in different ways in each particular country?
Well, the big frame, historically speaking, for anti-Semitism it's Christian anti-Semitism. It's the Roman Catholic Church, and many centuries of cultivating the idea that Jews are the ultimate enemy. Let me tell you something. In the 1920s, when my father would walk home from school in Bridgeport, Connecticut, he would be attacked by Catholic kids who would call him a Christ killer. Okay, so that it's impossible to put aside the theological frame in which what we call anti-Semitism has developed. And one of the salient points there is, and a point that I argue to students, is that fine, you know, you can study all the crimes of the Nazis and their methods and their ideas and all of that. But the fact of the matter is that they invented very little, and that theological anti-Semitism basically set the table for what happened in the 19th century. You know, you think of the Brown historians' books on the popes and the Jews, for example. This is just an uncomfortable fact. When you talk when you give a course on anti-Semitism, you ask students, "You have any idea where this comes from?" And you break the news that there is a huge Christian theological component to this. It starts in the Gospel of St. John, 8:44. The Jews, Jesus is alleged to have said the Jews are the children of the devil. And this has just been an infinitely destructive sort of theological, ideological influence on lots of people. And then a perverse character like Hitler comes along, and the demonization of the Jews has been accomplished thoroughly for centuries. And medieval images of Jews with horns, et cetera, can be found in the minds of Texas school children in the 21st century.
The only thing I'd add to that is, and I'll speak of Germany in particular, but I'm sure there are many people on the call here on this conference who know more about Germany than I do. But I do spend some time there. I do spend some time working on Germany. If you look at the AfD, the right-wing party in Germany today, which is certainly filled with anti-Semitism, there are strong, obviously, German roots to that anti-Semitism, but a lot of it is also somewhat similar to what we're seeing in the U.S., where this is a protest against, this is anger against the direction of German society, often rooted in the East, though not exclusively in the East, and rooted in concerns about how power and status is shifting in German society, or how perceived power and status has shifted. And it's a function of the long outgrowth of not just the reunification of Germany and the unequal consequences east and west of that, but a long experience during the Cold War also, and the differences between the East and the West. That's not a complete explanation. That might not even be the main explanation, but that's certainly part of it.
Yeah, on the AfD, what's interesting too is, I think in general, although I'm in the fairly early stages of my research, one of the things I'm seeing on the right now is there's an even more intense kind of transnational or transatlantic cross-fertilization of ideas, right? That's always been there, right, on the right, but it seems to be intensifying and much more visceral and obvious, using the same terms, the same language, the same thinkers, same structures, right? And the paper of the AfD, the Junge Freiheit, there's very kind of similar, in certain ways, it's very similar to Breitbart with the latest kind of immigrant or refugee outrage, except they kind of pepper their opinion pages with quotes from Heidegger or Nietzsche or Junge or something like that, right? Because it's they're the intellectualized kind of Nazis, basically, so but that I think there is, I think, a real cross-fertilization of ideas. But I think, to me, the more kind of salient kind of connection to a modern anti-Semitism, I think, goes back to Hannah Arendt's argument in Origins of Totalitarianism, right? That I find this theory interesting. I don't know if it's true that basically colonialism, right, changed the nature of anti-Semitism in the 19th century, right? So it changes anti-Semitism from a kind of Christian base of the Jew as a heretic to the Jew as a racial other, right? So in that, if you reframe it so that modern anti-Semitism arises kind of as a blowback to colonialism, what you kind of see is it's more intricate connections to other forms of racism, right? That could explain things like the Turner Diaries, that can explain how it just fits so easily within a much more broader racist milieu, right?
So we have about 5 more minutes here tonight, and I just want to pose one kind of final question to each of our esteemed panelists. How do you see a way forward? Jeremy certainly referenced the idea of being informed as one crucial component of that process. But what are other aspects of how we can move forward on the question of anti-Semitism in American society, particularly in this moment where we've seen such an erosion of so many parts of democratic norms? How do we move forward within America on the question of anti-Semitism?
What a question. The first thought that occurs to me is that one specific type of political ideological action that is at least conceivable is doing everything possible to delegitimize Donald Trump in the years to come, and to mount very public campaigns, call it propaganda, simply pointing out the truth of the damage that he has done. How he got away with the homicidal negligence during the coronavirus pandemic is a wonder to me. I don't, he lost the election, but there were 74 million people who watched hundreds of thousands die under his disengagement and still voted for him. So that to me is the only sort of tangible strategy I can think of immediately.
Yeah, Hina, can we unmute you? I think is that the.
You're remuted.
Let's try it now. Go ahead. I think you got it. Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think so. Nama asked this question in the chat about in the Q&A about whether or not there should be more collaboration between Jews and Muslims, and there was another question that somebody asked about sort of collaborations as well between different groups. So I mean, I definitely think that. So I have three answers. One is that sort of collaboration. I mean, I think just this sort of collaboration here is important. I mean, I think that me being here, not because I'm me, but because I'm a Muslim person on this panel, is really important. And I think that it's important for us, for as many people as possible, to be engaged in these sorts of efforts so that we can draw attention to the connections between anti-Semitism and these other forms of bigotry. The second thing is, I think we have to really internally take like a stance against tribalism. We are all parts of different tribes, and I know it's a little counterintuitive and odd to say that the way to like anti-Semitism to some extent is predicated on the idea of a Semitic group or a Jewish group or a tribe of a certain sort. So it's a little bit counterintuitive to say that the solution to that is to kind of fight tribalism, but inside of ourselves or wherever we see it. But I just don't see how tribalism ever ends well, whether we're talking about white tribes or Christian tribes or Muslim tribes, or even the type of right-wing rhetoric that is made impossible in Israel today because of a certain sort of tribalism there. So that's one thing. And the other is, I think we just have to, I think a really strong and clear dedication to democracy and the rule of law and human rights and civil rights is really central, because if that is strengthened, then all of these other forms of bigotry will sort of take care of themselves. I don't think it's ever possible to entirely root out anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or anti-Black sentiment from people. But we want to minimize it as much as possible and sort of make it as relatively innocuous or relatively harmless as possible. So those are my suggestions.
So I have a list of a few bullet points on this, because I think there's a lot we can do, and I think this is a reason to be optimistic. We have a long historical record of fighting anti-Semitism, just as anti-Semitism is an old story. The combat with anti-Semitism and that history should tell us we're not going to get total victory. It's still going to be there. But what are some of the things that have worked in different contexts? First, what we're doing here, what the Schusterman Center does, right? We have to educate people. People have to recognize it. They have to recognize anti-Semitism when it's in front of them. A lot of our students are not anti-Semitic, but they might use anti-Semitic tropes without recognizing that. Part of what we're doing is not being politically correct. We're not cutting off free speech, but we're exposing people to the content of what their speech and how their speech and the effects of their speech and what their speech means, right? That's the job we're in as educators. I think we need to build allies. One of the most effective ways of combating anti-Semitism in American history has been just what Hina was saying, getting beyond identity politics and forming alliances with other groups. This was incredibly fruitful during the civil rights movement. We all know that story. It's one of many examples. We need to build allies. We need to reach out to groups, and we need to find good allies and make sure we're working closely with them and not choose people for short-term expedience. Back to where we were before. I'll say it explicitly. Benjamin Netanyahu is not an ally of anti-Semitic activism in the United States. He does not help the cause, right? He does not help the cause. We need better allies for those activities. We need to support organizations that do important work to protect communities, to get the word out. We haven't mentioned the Anti-Defamation League yet. I think they do extraordinary work. They're one of many organizations. And these organizations don't have to be Jewish organizations. Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson's work, which is focused largely on African Americans. That's incredibly valuable for what we care about. We need to call out anti-Semitism, especially when it's used by people around us who we are giving legitimacy to. When people send emails saying racist things about students, we need to call that out and call it out more loudly than we have, even if they're wealthy donors. And the same applies to wealthy, powerful people who say anti-Semitic things. It has to be called out, and we have to be willing to take a hit and not receive the donations from those people. We have to call it out. If we don't call it out, it becomes legitimate. And we have an obligation, even with what little power and status we have, to use that. And then finally, and I think this is happening, and we need more of it, we need to prosecute those who are especially violent anti-Semitic actors. They need to be prosecuted. The Justice Department, local law enforcement has to go after them. We have learned that anti-Semites, particularly violent anti-Semites, don't stop their violence until they are stopped. And part of restoring our democratic norms is using our Justice Department, using our law enforcement for that purpose. That should be a priority. And I'm optimistic that our new Attorney General gets this. Whether he'll be able to do it, we'll see. But I think Merrick Garland understands this. I think it's horrible that we had an Attorney General before this who clearly didn't prioritize these issues.
Everything that Hina and Jeremy said, plus I'll give a kind of a crass materialist answer too, which is that, I tend to see the question of how to fight anti-Semitism is bound up with the fight against fascism or right-wing authoritarianism, or whatever we want to call it. But it's democracy has to be shown to deliver the goods, right, on some level, in the sense that, you look at Western Europe after World War II up until the 80s, these kind of far-right mobilizations were tiny. They were super fringe until we get neoliberalism, right? And then you have a left that and a kind of a social democratic parties that aren't able to really deliver anything, right? Similar to the Democratic Party here, right? And so, if with the Biden administration and folks have to push this too, because they never do anything on their own, they have to deliver big on something that changes the everyday lives of like working class and middle class people, and if they don't, then if they do that, they take the oxygen out of the room for anti-Semites, far-right folks. I mean, you take away that, then you take away the very air that far-right actors breathe in. So,
thank you all for your contributions this evening. Unfortunately, because of time, we're going to have to pause this conversation, but I hope that we're able to take it up again soon. And I'm really grateful again to John Hoberman, Hina Azam, Jeremy Suri, and Christopher Viles for their contributions to this conversation on anti-Semitism in the far right in America. Thank those of you who are here in the audience for being here tonight, and I wish you all a safe and wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.